I did go through the transcript last night in reference to that, and saw some of the things. The things that struck me most were Justice Kennedy and Kagan, and some of the things that they had said. I know you're following a lot closer. How do you feel about it?
Well, I have. I think the concern perhaps is. I mean, if you listen to what Kennedy says, he said a lot of things to both sides that showed that he was concerned. And for me, I think that he will probably be on our side, on the side of King, as opposed to on the side of the government, because he said things like, well, you're probably right about the wording, but I'm still concerned. So if I were to just explain to your listeners, perhaps the biggest thing that came up in that discussion was coercion. So Kennedy was concerned about coercion of the states by the federal government and saying that that is unconstitutional. And King's attorney, Michael Carvin, said, well, actually, you all decided in a Medicaid Obamacare case that the only way it could be coercive was if it was essentially a gun held to your head. And this is not a gun held to your head. And so the interesting thing about this is because even the federal government's attorney did not argue this. And in fact, when pressed about this being unconstitutional and coercion, he tried to go the other way and basically say, that's kind of not a problem for us. And the reason why that is because so many laws, particularly from the department, from the federal government, say to the states, you can have this money if you do such and so. Those are the federal strings that are often tied to laws. And if the court would decide that this was unconstitutional this was a coercive way to do this and therefore unconstitutional, that would essentially make all those other federal strings, all those other laws with federal strings, that would suddenly be problematic for the department across a whole plethora of laws, and they don't even want to go there. They don't want to go, the government, the Obama administration does not want to go to where Kennedy went. And this morning in the Wall Street Journal, the Attorney General Scott Pruitt from Oklahoma had an interesting article that is called A State Reply to Justice Kennedy, and he says, we are not children who must be protected by the federal government from making choices. And he said, Oklahoma, this is a trade-off. Oklahoma made a decision that we don't want our employers and our individuals to be subject to the Obamacare mandates and taxes. And therefore, we made a decision we would not take the subsidies. And thus, this forcing us to take the subsidies through the federal exchange is wrong. And therefore, he's asking the justices to rule on behalf of King because the government knows what it's doing. It was trying to force Oklahoma to do what Oklahoma had a choice about, to actually protect their people, because if there's no subsidies, there's no employer mandates, there's no employer penalties, and a lot of people who would be under the individual mandate and penalties are no longer under the individual mandate and penalties. So I think that Kennedy will go and decide with King. But the real question is, at the end of the day, probably what will Chief Justice Roberts do? And Chief Justice Roberts was very quiet. And he's the one who turned in 2012 and decided to essentially keep the individual mandate in place by calling it a tax. So I think everybody is really wondering what will Roberts do. But the other thing is, you mentioned that we wouldn't hear anything till June. If Justice Alito had his way, probably we wouldn't hear anything until November or December or maybe October, right before the next open enrollment.
Why
because
is that?
He wants to have as many people as possible having coverage throughout the end of the year
right,
before
right,
they'd
right.
make their decision, and therefore there wouldn't be this disruption that the government says that there will be.
Right. Well, so you're thinking that, which makes sense, that the concern, as Kennedy might say, it's unconstitutional, but I'm concerned. He's concerned for the repercussions with other mandates. Probably more concerned about that than he is anything else, and what that's going to do. That this thing's going to snowball and just open up a can of worms.
I think Kennedy is less concerned about that than the federal government is, because the federal government is afraid that if the Supreme Court rules that this is a coercive tactic, then it would mean that so many other programs and laws that have this very same tactic, where the federal government says, we have this money here, if you do thus and so, you can have it. This is what the federal government does all the time. If suddenly all of this is unconstitutional, it will make it unconstitutional across the board for all of these programs. And then the government probably feels like, now we're in trouble. Now we can't be persuasive by our federal strings to try and get the states to do this. Suddenly it'll all be unconstitutional, that they would be compelled by the very fact that we hold money out for them. So I think it is less Kennedy. Kennedy is trying to use it perhaps as a way to say, let's not disrupt what is going on here for the 6.5 million people who have the subsidies, and maybe we can call this coercion. But the federal government is saying, oh, please, Kennedy, don't go that way.
And
we want you to rule for us, but not like that.
Right. Justice Kagan making an effort to take the sentence that King is basing the suit on, or one of the things they're basing the suit on, the sentence, and trying to put it into context with the entire law, saying, well, wait a minute, we can't look at that one issue. She even gave an analogy of, a pretty simple analogy in reference to that, and trying to just say, look, we've got to look at the context of the law. Right. And
yes. Well, and that's problematic if you believe in the rule of law, because then suddenly, if you're going to have to look at the context, it all becomes interpretation. And suddenly the words in a law don't matter anymore. They don't mean anything if you can interpret your way around them.
And if
so
you can,
it's really important in our law and in jurisprudence to understand that we have a rule of law. We have black words on a white page, and they were actually put there for a purpose. There's much argument sometimes over even one word. Should it be this or should it be that? And there are amendments made, and there are debates on the floors of Congress, debates on the floors of, state houses and state senates, all about one word. So words mean something. If suddenly you can interpret your way around them by context, we have a problem.
Is there going to be a problem if King wins? What are some of the aftermath of victory for King for us?
So here's what I try to just tell people is Obamacare is filled with pain. So it's when do you want your pain and how long do you want your pain?
Right.
So Obamacare has already caused all sorts of people pain by the loss of the policies that they had, by now higher premiums, higher deductibles, by being forced to pay for things they don't need. There's a lot of pain. They're losing their doctors. They're losing their access to the clinic they've long had. They have to go somewhere else because of a narrow network. Pain, 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 right? So if King wins, there will be pain experienced by the people who thought, oh, good, we get the taxpayers' money to help us pay for these really high premiums as a result of everything that the law requires. We will lose our subsidies, which might cause us to lose our insurance for those. That's what these 6.5 million people are probably going to say. This is our pain. It's being taken away from us. But on the other side is all the people who today are in pain because they are wrongly being penalized and under the mandate. There are 37 states. Now, maybe I should say 34, because both the government and the King's attorney all said 34 states. So let's just go with 34. There are 34 states that do not have a state-based exchange. And if you look at the plain wording of the law, there should be no subsidies available in those states. Right. And without subsidies, that means that there are no penalties, no mandates, and for most individuals, they will not be under the individual mandate or the penalty. So there is pain going on now because the law is not being followed as written. And they will, if King wins, they will be free. There will be 34 states of people who are free, employers who are free, employees who can have 40-hour jobs without worrying about it. They're not going to be limited to 28-hour jobs. There'll be a whole range of freedoms because King wins. So there's pain no matter what way you go. If Obama wins, there's pain because now 34 states will be under the mandate and the penalty when they really shouldn't be. And we will have embedded Obamacare further into our country's healthcare system, making it more difficult to get out and therefore restricting health freedom potentially far into the future.